So I'm going to give you a quick tutorial on the statistic, the correlation. Okay, and so the statistic of a correlation is denoted by the symbol R. Okay, and correlations can take a variety of numbers, but they can range. So the correlation can range from a -1 to a +1. Okay, and the value of a correlation will be two things: the value, or absolute value, I should say. So without the balance, without the plus or the minus, determines the strength or the predictive power of a correlation. Whereas the valence, or the plus or minus sign, indicates whether the correlation is positive or inverse. So a negative would be an inverse correlation. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples how you could see this in a graph. So when we use correlations when both of our variables are continuous in nature, things like a scale of 1 to 5 or a grade from 0 to 100, things of this nature. So let's say we have a graph and we have two variables, and we want to look and see if there's a relationship between grief and depression. And those are our two variables. And for each person we give a survey to, we assess both grief and depression. And perhaps one person got a 1 in grief and a 1 in depression. And we could plot them right there. They got a 1 in grief, 1 in depression. 2, 3, 4, 5. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and then another person took the survey and they got a 5 in grief and also a 5 in depression. And so they'd be somewhere along here. Maybe someone else got a 3 and a 3. Okay. So each of these dots is an individual who has filled out a survey that assesses both grief and depression. And so individuals could fall anywhere, and each of these dots is a different person's score on those two variables. And what you'd notice on this one is that you have kind of a line going this way. That's not a perfect line, but you can kind of see a line going that. That would indicate a positive correlation. And maybe something like this would be like a positive 0.72 or something like that. If every dot fell exactly on the line, you'd have a positive 0.1.0 correlation, a perfect correlation. As they start to fall off this line of prediction, the correlation falls and gets closer to 0. Okay? A correlation of 0 might look something like this, where your two variables, let's say we looked at grief and your attitude toward ice cream. Maybe everybody loves ice cream, whether you're grief-stricken or not. And we wouldn't expect these two variables to be correlated. You might get something that looks more like this when you plot each individual. Two scores, their scores on grief and ice cream. And so a graph like that, the correlation might be more like a positive 0.02 or a negative 0.05. So it's close to 0, or it's, you know, it has no meaning. It might as well be 0. Okay, so that would be a 0 correlation, or no correlation. No correlation. Finally, you could have something like self-esteem and depression. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, I like those 5-point scales. And maybe someone who's low in self-esteem and gets a 1 would be like maybe a little higher in depression. And someone who gets a 5 in self-esteem is a little lower in depression. And people score all along the way. And if you're in the middle of self-esteem, you're kind of in the middle of depression. Okay, something like this, where your line of prediction is going this way, would be a negative correlation. It doesn't mean there's no correlation. It means there is a correlation, but it's inverse. If you're high on one, you're low on the other. And if you're low on one, you're high on the other. Okay, so this might be something like a negative 0.71 correlation, or a negative 0.80, or something like that. But basically, you've got two correlations that are very predictive. One is positive because if you're low in one, you're low in the other. If you're high in one, you're high in the other. They go together. But the other one is a negative correlation. It doesn't mean the absence of a correlation. It means that if you're high on one variable, such as depression, you're low on the other, self-esteem. And if you're high in self-esteem, you're low in depression, and all along the way. So it's still very predictive. It's just an inverse relationship, okay? And then you've got something like this, which would show no correlation at all. So, for example, if I gave you 4 correlations, I said something like positive 0.05, negative 0.82, negative 0.30, and positive 0.71. And I said, which of these correlations is the strongest correlation? You would actually pick the negative 0.82, because even though it's negative, it doesn't mean that's the absence of a correlation. It means that it's an inverse correlation. If you're high on one variable, you're low on the other. And so you only look at the value of the number without the valence to figure out which one is strongest. Then you look at the valence to determine whether the correlation goes together or whether it's inverse, meaning high on one, low on the other would be the inverse correlation.